So this interwar period is going to consist of the Great Depression mostly. So our causes were people were buying on credit too much. That means they were buying something, but they didn't pay money. They just said, "I'll pay you back later," and that's what credit is. Like when you buy stuff through a credit card, you don't use your own money, you use the bank's money. That's credit, and then you're going to pay them back at the end of the month. Okay, but the problem is people were not paying back the credit that they bought on. So that created a lot of debt and a lot of instability in the market. Also, we have this cycle of debt. So the US is loaning some money to Germany after World War I. Germany is using that money to pay the reparations to France and Britain. And then France and Britain are using that reparation money to pay the US back in the money that they borrowed from them during the war. So if you follow the cycle, you can see that the only country that actually has money is the US. So what's going to happen when the US runs out of money and the stock market crashes? Everyone's economy is going to crash. Okay. So the stock market crashes in New York, and that starts off a depression in the US. That is going, so the US cannot loan money to Europe anymore to sustain its economy. So that's going to cause Europe's economy to tank. And then since Europe's economy is part of all of these colonial powers because they have colonies all over the globe, then their economies are also going to just plummet because their economies are dependent on Europe's economies. So we're going to look at how different countries responded to the Depression. First, we're going to look at the US, and we don't have to focus on the US that much because you're going to, if you take AP US history next year, you're going to focus more on that. But just know their president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he gets elected and he institutes welfare programs like Social Security that's going to give money and aid and food to people directly. And he's going to institute some long-term reforms like the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is going to regulate the stock market so that it doesn't crash again, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is going to ensure that people's savings at the bank are insured to a certain point, because when the Depression hit, when the stock market crashed, a lot of people ran to the bank and pulled out all of the money they had. And the bank doesn't have everyone's money all at once. So once all of their money ran out, everyone else that came afterwards, they couldn't pull their money out of the bank. Okay, then we're gonna look at the Soviet Union. And like we said on Friday, the Soviet Union, because it was born out of this communist dream, but a lot of countries were against communism, so they sent in armies to kind of like squash the communist revolution, but it happened anyway. So the new country, the new communist government of Lenin and Stalin was very paranoid that people were going to be against their type of government. So they instituted a lot of repressive policies on its citizens. So if, and this was happening under Lenin, once Lenin died in 1928, Stalin is going to take over, and he's going to ramp up the oppressiveness of the regime like to 100. So he starts these things called gulags, and gulags are just labor camps where if he hears even a whisper against the government, you get sent to the gulag. You don't get seen or heard from again. You get sent to the labor camps, and then there you either spend the rest of your life or you die immediately because you're starving and you're working to death. Okay, he also instituted his 5-year plan, which was like a new economic plan that to revitalize the nation because Russia was broke and hungry after the First World War. So this is a plan to get Russia on par with the rest of the European powers, to get it industrialized again, and to get its agriculture ramping up. So what Stalin did is he started this process of collectivization, which means he had all of these peasant farmers. He took their land and he put them under a collective, otherwise known as a kolkhoz, and all of the farmers are going to farm, and any crops that they produce is going to be taken by the government, and it's going to be redistributed all over the country. Okay, so in theory, this sounds like a good idea, like everyone's going to get food. In reality, the food was mostly given to urban centers, so mostly to big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the farmers in the rural areas were left with little to nothing. And this happened especially a lot, this created a lot of famine, especially in Ukraine. And this part is I think it's very interesting. This is what I studied in college. The famine in Ukraine is sometimes interpreted as a genocide by Stalin to the Ukrainian people, because Stalin took away all of the Ukrainian farmers' crops, and they had to meet certain quotas, like they had to produce a certain number of crops. And if they didn't produce that certain number of crops, well, guess what happened? They get thrown in the gulag. Also, when people in Ukraine try to migrate to urban centers outside of the Ukraine to actually get food, the government did not let them leave that area. So it was keeping them there in that starved, famine-infested area. So a lot of people died, and a lot of people also reverted to cannibalism during this time. This was the 1930s. Okay, now let's look at Germany. I'm just going to go over briefly because we already went over this. We know that Germany was not happy about the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, and their economy tanked with the Great Depression. So Germans were not happy, Germans were jobless, and Germans were broke. So this guy, Adolf Hitler, he becomes leader of the Nazi Party, and the Nazi Party is saying that we have the answer to all of Germany's problems. We know how to get Germany, we know how to get Germans jobs, we know how to get them food, we know how to get the economy back on track, we know how to make Germany great again. Okay, so you can see how people in Germany elected Hitler as their leader. Also, he blamed a lot of Germany's problems on the Jews, and this is going to contribute to the Holocaust. Okay, and Germany went fascist, and fascist originated with Benito Mussolini. He's the leader of Italy in the 1920s. So he took power, and he kind of like invented this idea of a fascist government. And a fascist government, basically, it wants extreme nationalism. So we talked about nationalism. It's my country over everyone else's country. It's patriotism to an extreme. And he took nationalism to an extreme. He also glorified the military. So he took control of the military, and he wanted everyone to worship the military. Also, fascists like to blame the country's problems on ethnic minorities. So like the Gypsies in Italy and like the Jews in Germany, problems were blamed on them. Also, they do not like communists, okay? So Mussolini is the first fascist, and then that inspires Germany to go fascist, and that inspires Hitler. And so Hitler and Mussolini are going to become BFFs. They're going to be like this during the Second World War, and they're going to form an alliance. Okay, so we already went over this before we left. These are some events that lead to the World War II in Europe. So first we have Hitler wants to make Germany great again. So he wants to recover all of the German land that he believes belongs to Germany. That includes any lands that have German-speaking people in it, like Austria. So he annexes Austria. That means he takes control over Austria. But the Austrians kind of let it happen. They're like, yeah, sure, we want to be with Germany. So it wasn't like a conquering type of situation. And then he starts conquering. He conquers the Sudetenland, which is a part of Czechoslovakia. And France and Great Britain give into Hitler's demands because they want to avoid another war, and this is called the Munich Agreement. And then a year later, Hitler signs the non-aggression pact with Stalin, the leader of Soviet Union. So they sign a pact to not attack each other and to work together to kind of divide Europe amongst both of them. Hitler is going to end up betraying Stalin, and that's going to be a major mistake. But before that, Hitler is going to invade Poland, and that's when France and Great Britain are going to actually give a crap about Germany doing all its conquering, and it's going to start World War II in Europe. So we're talking about Europe. Let's go to the Pacific and deal with Japan. So how did Japan deal with the Depression? Well, Japan is a very resource-poor country. That means they don't have a lot of resources. So what they did is that they looked to getting resources outside of Japan. And the only way you can do that is by establishing colonies. So by this time, by the 1930s, they already had Korea, they already had Taiwan, they had a few islands in the Pacific, and they were looking to expand into China. Okay, in 1931, they invaded Manchuria, and they established the puppet government of the Manchukuo. And then they were looking to expand onto the rest of China. Okay. And Japan did this under the guise of uniting all Asians. So they called this the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, where they just wanted to unite all of Asians be happy together, singing, and all united, but only under Japan and only under the Japanese emperor. Okay, so this officially starts World War II. And if you notice, we haven't mentioned the US. We know how the US joined World War II. So before the US actually officially joined, it was low-key on the Allies side because they were lending money to Great Britain through the Lend-Lease Act. And the US's president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was actually meeting secretly with the Prime Minister of Great Britain, which is Winston Churchill. And they were kind of like coming up with ways that the US could join, but the US didn't want to join because they wanted to be neutral. But then this event, Pearl Harbor, Japan attacking them, starts, it makes the US, we need to join because we've been attacked. We got to defend our honor. Okay, so I'm not really going to talk about a lot of the battles and everything during World War II because we kind of already covered that with your worksheets and everything, but we need to talk about the Holocaust because we need to talk about the causes and the consequences. So what caused the Holocaust? The Holocaust was a genocide. Okay, and I'm gonna, okay. So a genocide, if you don't know, its definition is intent to eliminate or eradicate a specific ethnic, racial, religious, gender, or political group. So the intent, so like the attempt to eliminate a whole group based on ethnicity, race, religion, gender, stuff like that. The Holocaust, Kat, are you okay? The Holocaust was Hitler's final solution plan. So this was his plan to eradicate the Jewish population from Europe. Okay, first he tried to deport all of Jews out of Germany, but once he started taking over more European land, he found more and more Jews in there because obviously they had escaped Germany to not be with Germany. But he found them. So he's like, I have this problem of having a big population of Jewish people that I don't like and I kind of want to get rid of. Well, why don't I just get rid of them? Okay, he didn't think that there would be any consequences to his action because the Turkish government did a genocide to the Armenians during World War I, and there were no consequences for them. So he thought he could get away with it. So first, you can't just like round up people and exterminate them. You got to do it slowly. First, you got to take away their rights. Okay, so this happened with the Nuremberg laws. Okay, this took away Jews' citizenship So once you take away their citizenship, they have fewer civil rights. That means they do not have right to trial by jury. They do not have right to to a fair trial. When they get arrested, they can just arrest them and take them wherever. And they can't say anything because they're not citizens anymore. Also, they want to incite some fear and get all of the population to see our Jews as non-human. So the Nazi government actually orchestrated this. It's called Kristallnacht, and it's the Night of Broken Glass. And it was a night where it had Germany experienced a lot of anti-Jewish riots. That caused a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment. Okay, there was anti-Jewish sentiment already in Europe, but Hitler took advantage of this and kind of hyped it up. Okay, you see a lot of you got a question, Michaela? Yes, do you have a question? If you have a question, shout it out, because I can't see the chat. No? Okay. Awesome. Well, I'm not posting this PowerPoint yet because we haven't finished, but we're done after today, so I'll just post it after we're done with this. Okay, so you see a lot of propaganda that's comparing Jews to rats, and that's a form of dehumanization. That means we're looking at them less than human. You can compare it to when the Europeans conquered Africa, and they put some Africans in zoos, and they compared them to animals. That's a form of dehumanization. That makes it easier to see someone as not human, so it makes it easier to bring harm to them. Okay, so once they did this, they rounded Jews up and put them in ghettos, and that's where the word ghetto comes from. So like a very poor neighborhood with like poor plumbing, poor sanitation, stuff like that. And from that place is where they would round up the Jews and take them to the concentration camps where the actual extermination is going to happen. All right, so some of the consequences of the Holocaust were 11 million people were dead, but only 6 million of them were Jews. The other 5 million were, because Hitler also did not like communists, because fascists don't like communists. He did not like homosexuals. He did not like people that were disabled or mentally ill. And he did not like gypsies as well, which is another ethnic group. Okay, after the Holocaust and the Allies and the whole world discovers all the horrors that the Jews went through, it kind of fueled the Zionist movement again, which we mentioned after World War I with the Balfour Declaration, where Great Britain kind of promised that there would be a state only for Jews. So this is going to be like, oh, it's going to make them realize we probably do need to make this happen because all of these horrible things happen to the Jews. So if we give them a state that's all of their own, then maybe these horrible things won't happen to them. Okay, so it established the creation of Israel. We'll get into that after we finish this unit. Also, this is when the word genocide is actually coined by Raphael Lemkin, who is a Jew that survived the Holocaust. Okay. Now, the Germans were not the only power that committed war crimes. The Japanese also committed some war crimes, and this is crimes that are against war. So you might be thinking, but it's war, like anything goes. Well, according to the Geneva Convention, there are certain crimes that you cannot commit while you're at war. Like you can't torture, you can't mistreat prisoners of war. You can't kill civilians. That's another war crime. You can't intentionally target places of cultural significance. And this is one example of this is when the US was bombing Japan, they bombed every single city. Now I'm talking about the atomic bombs, talking about like regular bombs. They bombed every single city except for Kyoto, which is where the emperor lives. And it's like the origin of all of Japanese culture. So they intentionally targeted every city except for Kyoto, because that is a place of cultural significance, so that they wouldn't get caught committing a war crime. Now, the Japanese, on the other hand, they did commit a lot of war crimes. Their first one was the rape of Nanjing, which happened in China. So Nanjing was the capital city of China during World War II, and the Japanese took it over so that they could take over China. And they went in and they wanted to kill off all of the Chinese soldiers, but the Chinese soldiers had disguised themselves as civilians. So now the Japanese didn't know which ones were soldiers and which ones were not. So they went ahead and they just killed every civilian. They killed all of the men. Okay, and then they saw some women there, so obviously they raped them, and then they killed them so that they wouldn't be witnesses. So this happened over the course of months, and Chinese civilians were locked into their homes. They were afraid to go out, especially the women, and they killed, I forgot how many exactly, but thousands of civilians were killed. Okay, and the leader of China during this time, Chiang Kai-shek, he was in charge of the city, but he chose to abandon it. And remember, if you don't remember, he was the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party. So that was ruling China during this time, but China was having a civil war between the nationalists and the communists. So this is going to make the nationalists look bad, and it's going to make China will go even more towards communism. Okay, another war crime that the Japanese committed, and this is the most egregious one in my opinion, is called comfort women. Okay, and these were women that were mostly from Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and they were forced into sexual slavery to the Japanese military. So what the Japanese military would do is they would either offer women like work in factories or just straight up kidnap them, and they would take them to military bases and they would have them comfort soldiers, Japanese soldiers. Okay, so basically they would allow the soldiers to rape them. Okay, this is a huge, highly sensitive issue when it comes to Korea-Japanese relationships now. Like the Japanese government hasn't apologized, and the Korean government wants reparations for this, basically, because a lot of these women are still alive, and they are sometimes they're living in poverty. So they want reparations for this. This is a statue of a comfort woman, and this is actually in the capital of South Korea, Seoul, and it's right in front of the Japanese embassy. So it's kind of like a big middle finger to Japan. They have it right in front of their embassy. Okay, so I wasn't going to talk about the battles, but here are some important battles. Okay, and let's talk about the end of the war. So the end of the war in Europe happens around spring, because Hitler commits suicide in April. So he kind of like just throws in the towel before the war is even over. And Germany is left without a leader, and they're scrambling. They don't want to keep fighting, so they surrender in May. Also, so after Germany surrenders, their pal Italy has already been captured. Italy is done. Germany surrendered. Japan, however, is still fighting. And I talked about this before we left. The only way that the US gets Japan to surrender is by dropping the atomic bombs. That's the only way that they got them to surrender. They either could have invaded the Japanese mainland and risked American lives, or they could just, drop a few bombs and kill a bunch of Japanese. And they chose to go with dropping the bombs. So this ends the war officially, like the whole war. Japan becomes occupied by the US after the war, but we're going to get into that. But the effects of this, of World War II, is that the United Nations is formed. I had to see a typo. So the United Nations is formed, and the United Nations is basically a group of nations that